and celebrate in him. In effect, on the Sabbath day, Israel was called to begin living now like she would someday live in the presence of her God. The Sabbath rest is more than a rehearsal for what is to come in heaven. It is the beginning of life in heaven now. That's what the Sabbath was all about. That's why Sabbath rest was foundational in the Old Testament festivals. But Israel also celebrated a Sabbath day of weeks. Leviticus 23:15. From the day after the Sabbath, the day you break the sheaf of the wave offering, count off 7 full weeks. Count off 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then present an offering of grain to the Lord. That is how the Feast of Weeks got its name, because it was a Sabbath day of weeks. Israel also celebrated a Sabbath day of months. In Leviticus 25, verse 1. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Sabbath day of months. These festivals pointed directly to the promise of paradise. And in Leviticus 25, Israel celebrated a Sabbath day of years, the sabbatical year. Look at Leviticus 25, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm giving you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath rest to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields, and for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year, the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord." Every 7 years, Israel had to rest the land. Israel had to rest the land. And this wasn't just good agricultural practice. This was God's way of letting Israel grow in her faith. Israel, more than ever in this 7th year, depended upon God to provide for her needs. And this 7th year celebration was simply a reminder to Israel that she depended on God's provision. And in a way, it was the way of her learning to live without the curse of sin. The day would come when God would provide for Israel without her need to work. So we have a Sabbath of days, a Sabbath of weeks, a Sabbath of month, a Sabbath of years, known as the sabbatical year. And you can probably see the pattern developing. For next, Israel celebrated a Sabbath of sabbatical years. If a sabbatical year was a 7-year period, 7 of those periods would bring us to the sabbatical year that was known as the year of Jubilee. Some of you may be thinking that his sermon should be about over and we're just getting to the subject. But the reality is, everything we've talked about here today is about the year of Jubilee. In fact, the entire message up till now has been about the year of Jubilee. It was really intended to be the ultimate Sabbath celebration. For it was really intended to be the time when we begin living in heaven. Not heaven up there, but heaven right here. Just like we had in the Garden of Eden. Heaven and earth came together in the Garden of Eden. God and man lived in harmony. And Sabbath rest, especially in the year of Jubilee, was a beginning for Israel to understand what it meant to live in the presence of God. The year of Jubilee was to be the closest ideal of heaven that Israel would ever experience this side of glory. All the regulations regarding the year of Jubilee were there to give Israel a sample of what was to come. But it was also to help them to begin to live in the reality of heaven right now. The year of Jubilee, all the regulations can be summed up in 3 different groups. 3 simple groups. First, there was rest for creation. there was rest for creation. The land had to rest. Israel could not harvest during that year. In fact, Israel couldn't plant during that year, which meant that the ground would actually be not producing for almost 3 years. There was rest for creation because creation, like Israel himself, had been burdened by the effects of sin. The year of Jubilee was to creation in anticipation of her freedom as well. Romans 8 verse 20 says this, "For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God." Second, in the year of Jubilee, the poor were redeemed. Poor people who, for whatever reason, needed to sell their land and lost their ability to earn a living. In the year of Jubilee, their land reverted back to them. When Israel came into the promised land, every family or clan was given a piece of land. That was not their land to own. It was their land to possess and to work. All the land belonged to God. And in the year of Jubilee, God demanded that Israel return that land back to the people to whom he had originally given it. It was a reminder to Israel that not only did she not own the land, but she did not own the wealth. God's land was to provide for the poor and the wealthy alike. In God's economy, all people are equal. And his land was to provide for all of his children. Leviticus 25, verse 23. "The land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants." Finally, all slaves were set free in the year of Jubilee. The grace of God sets men free. It does not enslave them, and nowhere is that more clearly seen than in the year of Jubilee when slaves were set free. In the last days of the Civil War, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, fell, and Abraham Lincoln insisted on visiting the city. And even though no one knew he was coming, the slaves recognized him immediately, and they flocked around him. And an admiral by the name of David Porter records what Lincoln said to the slaves. Lincoln said this, "My poor friends, you are free, free as the air. You can cast off the name of a slave and trample upon it. Liberty is your birthright." And in the Feast of Jubilee, liberty for the land, liberty for the poor, and liberty for the slaves was what was proclaimed. That was the year of Jubilee. God had proclaimed a year of liberty for his people. It was God's gift of freedom that he gave to the people of Israel. It was God's gift of freedom. He invited them to be free from the cares of the day. He invited them to be free from the sinful effects of society around them. And he invited them and gave them the freedom to celebrate him and his redemptive plan. And yet, the year of Jubilee was never observed once. Never once did Israel observe the year of Jubilee. Not until Jesus actually fulfilled it. Turn with me, if you would, to Luke chapter 4. Thank you, Jeff. Luke chapter 4. This is the passage we read at the beginning. Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to recover sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Those words, to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom to the prisoners, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord, are a direct reference to the year of Jubilee. In fact, he's quoting here from Isaiah 61, which is the only passage in the entire Old Testament that we haven't read this morning that even mentions the year of Jubilee. And here Jesus is at the beginning of his ministry saying, "I came to fulfill the year of Jubilee. I came to bring the people of God into the presence of God. I came to give them the liberty from the grip of sin on their lives. I came to set them free from the cares of the worry of this world and bring them into the presence of a holy God." In Matthew 13, Jesus tells his disciples that he came to plant the seed of the kingdom of heaven into the earth. And Jesus here makes us people of Jubilee. He gives us the freedom to live in the presence of God now. The people of God don't have to wait to heaven to live in the presence of God. He's given us the freedom to enjoy that now. So how do we live as the people of Jubilee? Here are 3 New Testament observations on what it means to be the people of Jubilee. First, Jubilee people passionately hate evil in any form. We don't tolerate evil. We don't put up with evil. We don't turn our back on evil. We passionately hate evil in any form. Romans 12:9 says, "They hate evil and they cling to what is good." That's what it means to be a person of the Jubilee. Second, Jubilee people are bold in their witness because they understand the words of Romans 16:20. I think I've read that passage 100 times. I've never seen it until this week. Jubilee people are bold in their witness because they understand the words of Romans 16:20. "The peace of God will soon crush Satan under your feet." Under your feet. Did you get that? The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. Why would we be anything but bold in our witness? Every time you tell somebody about what God has done, every time you witness for him, you trample on Satan. That's what Romans 16:20 says. The people of Jubilee are bold in their witness. Finally, the people of Jubilee have different priorities. When you are living in the presence of God, the things of this world just look dim. If you love this world, then you are not living in the presence of God. It's that simple. The day will come when all the people of God will be Jubilee people. And when that day comes, every knee will